this next string of videos is going to, obviously you can see already what it says, but I'll have already edited what the actual each segment of the theme is called. All right, so I will be unfortunately reading a entire chapter dedicated to the lore of the U.S.-Mexican border, and um, and how it's sort of used as an excuse to withhold people based on the excuse of um, or like quarantine and like safety protocols. So you can see how obviously it would be necessary to stop people or give people a certain like procedure, like a vaccine, before they come into the U.S. Obviously, that makes sense. Like, I'm not saying this is um, just let people in, just free roam. Like, to an extent, yeah, but not without procedures and protocols. But again, like I said, it just becomes like wrapped up in what people are doing in a bigoted fashion that blurs the line between just like safety protocols and, you know. Anyways, all right. Eugenic quarantine and eugenic gatekeeping on the U.S.-Mexican border. In March 1916, Mexicans living in the Twin Cities of Laredo on the Texas-Mexican border began to complain loudly to their local consul. They were outraged that the U.S. Public Health Service had started to brand their arms in permanent ink with the word "admitted" after they had bathed and physically examined at Laredo's International Footbridge. Angered as well, the Mexican consul set up a letter, sent a letter to the USPHS asserting that, quote, the American sanitary and immigration authorities are acting against all principles of respect, justice, and humanity by stamping Mexican citizens who are looking for work with indelible ink, end quote. The USPHS medical inspector in charge of operations in Laredo, H.J. Hamilton, disagreed, responding that this measure was neither a violation of rights nor an assault on dignity, but an action carried out, quote, for their own benefit, end quote. According to Hamilton, the ink branded was necessary to defend Texas from the lice, smallpox, and other germs usually carried by, quote, Mexican paupers, and in a letter to the U.S. Surgeon General in anticipation of denunciations in the Mexican press, he described it as a, quote, very good plan, end quote, that would help to deter, quote, future illegal entry, end quote, involving the authority of governor of Texas and the state's quarantine laws. Hamilton further contended that aside from introducing infectious diseases into cities and towns, Mexicans were a severe drain on the state's charity and welfare institutions. Oh, this rhetoric is obviously well known, as we all know. Justifying the actions of the USPHS as a form of benevolent paternalism, he added that by being so marked, clean, and admissible, Mexicans were differentiated from the numbers of anonymous ailing immigrants that circulated along the border. Within the days, this exchange between the Mexican consul and Laredo's medical inspector had been forwarded to the Mexican Secretary of Foreign Relations and the U.S. Department of Treasury. In a final uh, missive, an official from the U.S. Immigration Service explained to the Mexican consul that the stamp, which he denied contained undeniable ink, was employed in lieu of highly impractical identification cards and suggested that it effectively shielded Mexicans from the harshment of Texas Rangers. Hidden away in the papers of the Secretariat of Foreign Relations in Mexico City, this small incident encapsulates many of the conflicts and complexities that characterized the Mexican U.S. borderlands in the first half of the 20th century. On one hand, this confrontation elucidates the centrality of medicalization to the solidification of the border and to the atmosphere of heightened tension that shaped Mexican-Anglo relations. In this instance, the arms of Mexican border crossers were literally imprinted with proof of cleanness. In the eyes of the USPHS, bearing the word admitted converted Mexicans from status of undesirable and questionable outsider to that of quasi-citizen with, albeit temporary, constitutional and legal protection. In a related sense, the branding scandal demonstrates the extent to which the borderlands were becoming militarized in the early 20th century, seeking to bolster their authority as federal bodies. The Immigration Service and the Public Health Service argued that Mexicans marked as admissible by the United States would be safeguarded from the depredations of legal vigilantes. Through modern forms of policing, enumerations, and classifications, the USPHS and the U.S. Immigration Naturalization Services (INS) sought to civilize the quote Wild West by bringing order and administration to the barbarous frontier still teeming with outlaws. Oof. Hold on. The practice of stamping the arms of Mexicans that began in Laredo in 1916 presaged historical patterns that would unfold rapidly in the Southwest. Within 1 year, Mexicans crossing into the United States would be subjected to a much more harrowing rite of medicalization. Within 10 years, the U.S. Border Patrol would be formed and would start to implement strategies of surveillance, detection, and interception that continue to this day. In tandem, these two trends, medicalization and militarization, work to create a regime of eugenic gatekeeping on the U.S.-Mexican border that aimed to ensure the putative purity of the American family and nation while generating long-lasting stereotypes of Mexicans as filthy, lousy, and prone to irresponsible breeding. Oof. Alrighty then. Alright. The 1970 typhus quarantine. Less than a year after Laredo incident, the U.S. Government and the USPHS launched a quarantine targeted at the eradication of typhus fever, along with entire lengths of the U.S.-Mexican border. For more than 20 years, the border crossings and their baggage were subjected to rigorous procedures of disinfection and fumigation. The quarantine The quarantine hardened the boundary line between Mexico and the United States, facilitated the creation of the Border Patrol, and fostered scientific and popular prejudice about the biological inferiority of Mexicans. So now this is for safety, and it's becoming just this purity issue, even though we know that crossing boundaries with each other will create like diseases in general. It doesn't matter who you are, but yeah, I guess this is the sorry, just I'm outside under a tree and it's just okay. Alright, where was I? As with many of the important dimensions of history of medicine, race, and power in the American West, several of the principal protagonists of this drama had been active participants in eugenic and public health meetings at San Francisco's Panama Pacific International Exposition. Indeed, the USPHS's senior surgeon who instituted the quarantine, Claude C. Pierce, had served as chief sanitary officer at the fair. When the PPIE ended, the USPHS instructed Pierce to report to Laredo, Texas, to assess the likelihood of the serious typhus outbreak. Just as he had done when he implemented prophylactic measures in San Francisco, Pierce brought the racial presumptions of the tropical medicine that he had practiced for more than a decade into the Panama Canal to the U.S.-Mexican border. This context here was in the last chapter, but I've been wanting to read this chapter for a while, so um, there's certain things in books that I more likely will fit into a video that I can make, and some I'll just straight up read. But this chapter specifically was supposed to be a video along with others. So, all right. When Pierce arrived, a process of medicalization had already been underway in the borderlands for the preceding 3 decades. Antedating the United States, which was slower than many countries to adhere to the tenets of germ theory. The Mexican Health Service had established quantitative and fumigation plants in border cities and towns such as Ciudad Juarez and Lavado Narado. A Piedras Negras in the early 1890s. Sanitary agents in these facilities were responsible for sterilizing immigrants and animals, and for fumigating baggage entering Mexico. Although the USPHS stationed inspectors at various points along 2,000-mile border at about the same time, routines mirroring those in effect in Mexico were not standard until the 1910s. As the turn of the century, a lack of epidemics and a fluid, interconnected economy of peoples, industries, and cultures allowed for relatively easy passage through border stations in places such as El Paso and Laredo. During this era, in fact, immigration and the public health officials were primarily interested not in Mexico, but in the Chinese, Syrians, and Greeks who apparently avoided Ellis Island by using the border as a backdoor into the United States. Oh, backdoors in quotes, just in case you're reading, like, audibly or something. Okay. Documents of the INS and local oral history show that until the first decade of the 20th century, Mexicans regularly came into the United States unquestioned. For this reason, Greeks and Syrians often sought to learn enough basic Spanish to enter as Mexicanos. As the 20th century progressed, however, the Mexicans began to settle in the United States, often making a reasonable visit into permanent residence, and station along the border began to change. With the USPHS in the growth phase and with a generalized expansion of epidemiological surveillance, the U.S. border cities sporadically to enforce quarantines, usually for yellow fever and smallpox, against the southern neighbors. As nativists alarmed over rising numbers of newcomers, especially southern and eastern Europeans, fueled the formulation of stricter immigration laws. USPHS officials became more aware of the porosity of the Mexicans and Canadian borders. This transition was also catalyzed by the Mexican Revolution, which began in the northern states of Coahuila and Chihuahua in 1910. As the uprising spread and as Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa led thousands into armed struggle against the Mexican government, the USPHS and immigration officials began to express great trepidation about the increase in circulation of insurgents, refugees, and temporary laborers in the twin cities of El Paso, Juarez, and Laredo, Nevada. When news of the typhus epidemic in Mexico's interior surfaced in 1915, several cases of the fever appeared in 1950 in Laredo. the USPHS dispatched Pierce to the border. Reaching Laredo a few days before Christmas, Pierce met with Hamilton and local physicians who reviewed the history of a family, a mother and two sons, taken ill with typhus earlier than months, and the measures enacted to quell the disease. They explained that the patients were kept in isolation, that they were bathed with kerosene, what? That their hair was cropped, and that their family's, quote, shack and all its contents, end quote, as well as it an adjoining structure were burnt to the ground to destroy all the potential vermin. Jeez. Hamilton showed Pierce how the baggage of persons entering the United States was sulfur fumigated at the International Bridge, and revealing Mexico's superior medical infrastructure, the product of the centralized attempt to modernize the country during the decades long dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, that immigrants suspected of infection were deloused with the permission of local authorities at a Nuevo Laredo plant outfitted with the French steam chamber and boiler. With a French. Oh. After gathering information about the situation in Laredo, Pierce traveled to El Paso, where he began to refurbish the city's disinfection plant, spending approximately $6,000 remodeling and refurbishing it with up-to-date fumigation and bathing equipment. Alright, that's it for now. I gotta go to work soon. Peace, guys.